In this lecture, we want to look at the relationship between the Ottoman Sultanate and the numerous Arab populations that, after 1520, comprised at least half of the empire's population. And this gets us into a serious issue, and I've been stressing this earlier in the class, that the Ottoman Empire was a multinational empire. It was above race. The key definition was religion. Were you a member of the Muslim community, the Ummah? If you were, and if you could speak Turkish and you accepted the authority of the Sultan, you became one of the Osmali, the Ottomans ruling the empire. After 1517, with the conquest of Egypt, most of the lands where Arabic was spoken as the vernacular language, the language of the prophet, the language of God, came under the control of the Sultan Caliph in Constantinople. There were two exceptions. One of them was Yemen, and the other was Morocco. In both of these places, a traditional native dynasty of rulers. In the case of Yemen, these were Shiite Zadi imams who claimed descent from the Prophet. In Morocco, it was Sunni sultans, men who likewise claimed Arabic descent through the Prophet. They were able to rally native populations and warriors behind their rule and resist the Ottoman Sultan, who was clearly an interloper, a Turkish Caliph. And neither of those areas were ever controlled by the Ottomans. Well, there were efforts to try to control Yemen for about a century, from 1358 to 1635, but the Ottomans only maintained control of several of the key port cities, especially Mocha, which was essential for the Indian trade. They could never bring the hill tribes to heel, where the imams were popular, and eventually they just gave up. They would return in the late 19th century, and even then, they could not really control Yemen, and quite honestly, there was always an Arab revolt in Yemen. They didn't have to wait for the British to incite one in 1915. In the case of Morocco, it was outside of Ottoman control for nearly, for the entire period. The most that could be attained would be Ottoman beys in Algiers and Tunisia would supply the native ruling kings with assistance. This proved important in 1578 when the Moroccans defeated the Portuguese army at the Battle of Alzar-Kabir. But essentially, Morocco was outside of the control of the Ottomans. On the other hand, the vast majority of Arabic speakers were under Ottoman rule. And this is something that is often missed because when looking back upon earlier Islamic achievements, very often the Ottoman Empire is missed because it's classified as Turkish, and it never was. The term Arab, or Arabsha in Turkish, designated in the Ottoman period the Bedouin tribes of the desert. It did not in any way designate a nationality. In fact, the Arabs were not a millet. They were not recognized as their own nation the way the Orthodox Christians were, the way the Jews were, the way the Catholics resident in the empire were. Instead, it was a term that specified only the Bedouins, and people who spoke Arabic were known by a variety of terms. For one, the Egyptian peasants were never really considered one way or the other, Arabs or anything else other than Muslim peasants. The upper classes in Cairo were often referred to as Mamluks, which goes back to the old Mamluk aristocracy. In turn, the Arabs themselves, the Arab speakers, saw the Turks as Rum, which was once a term used to designate the Byzantines. Also, to add to the confusion, many Christians spoke Arabic as their first language in the Fertile Crescent, and they were never called Arabs at all. They were recognized as Christian millets, especially the Maronites, who were descendants of the old Monothelite heresy, who went into communion with Rome in the 13th century and dominated Mount Lebanon. They weren't seen as Arabs in any meaningful sense. And this is just true across the Arab provinces, that the population was not perceived as some kind of Arab nation waiting for an awakening, waiting for a nation state. Far from it. They were all members of the same Ummah, of the same community of believers. And there are many cases of Arabs over the whole course of Ottoman imperial history moving to Constantinople, learning Turkish, and joining the Ottoman elite. There was never a ban on Arabs entering the Ottoman elite. And again, in many instances, it all came down to your loyalty to the Sultan. And that's a point that we must keep always in mind when we're dealing with the Arab provinces. The Arabs were just one more member or part of that wider Islamic community. The emergence of a Turkish caliph, starting in 1517, did pose some problems for the Arab legalists and theologians in the newly conquered Arab provinces, particularly in the city of Cairo and the city of Damascus, where great colleges and religious schools had been in existence going back to the Abbasid period. A Turkish caliph was something of a problem because all previous caliphs could at least claim the fiction of tracing their descent back to members of the original followers of Muhammad or to the Prophet himself. And this was very, very important in the Shia tradition, where the only legitimate caliphs had to come from the grandsons of the Prophet, that is, the sons of Ali and Fatima. The Ottoman sultans did not have that. Later, as Ottoman rule became accepted, largely because of its longevity, there were Arab writers who invented fictitious genealogies to try to give some legitimacy to the House of Osman. For instance, already in the 16th century, there's stories circulating that the Ottomans were descended from Noah, one of the original prophets, and there's a whole genealogy of that. Another possibility was to associate the name Osman with Uthman. He was the third caliph, the caliph who ruled after Omar from 344 to 356. His murder led to the first civil war in the Islamic Empire. Uthman and Osman are essentially the same names. Osman is simply the Turkish version of the Arabic name. Well, somehow you try to connect the Ottomans with a genealogy there. But really, the major problem was that there was no connection, that the Turkish caliph represented a very, very different type of ruler than any of the previous caliphs. Now, it's often argued that the conquest of Egypt in 1517 changed the whole nature of the Ottoman state. That up until Selim's reign, that they really invoked the images of a Ghazi warrior, as well as the imperial images of Byzantium. Mehmet II, as you recall, took the title Caesar. He issued decrees to the Orthodox Church that were almost in line with what a Byzantine emperor would do. And that by conquering Egypt, Selim changed the entire nature of the Ottoman Empire from a Ghazi warrior state to a bureaucratic Islamic one, and that's overdrawn. Already in the 14th century, the sultans were acquiring many of the trappings of being a caliph, or the agent of the caliph. They used such terms as the shadow of God of the two earths, the caliph of God of the two earths. These terms were already in circulation in certain Ottoman circles before the conquest of Egypt. So by 1517, when Selim took Egypt, it was only logical that he should assume the title of caliph. After all, the Ottoman sultans were the most effective rulers of the Ummah. They were expanding the domains of Islam. They were beating back the heretics in the East. They were advancing the forces of Islam in the West against the Gavur, against the heathens, that is, the Christian powers. And so the acquisition of the title of caliph simply cemented ideas that were already very well established within the ruling classes of Constantinople. That was fine for the Turks, but what would all these new Arab subjects make of it? Because before the Turkish conquest, there had been a caliph in Cairo who could claim to be a descendant of Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, going back to the Abbasids. That was now ended. The new Turkish caliph was now the guardian of the two holy cities. Although his governor resided in Jeddah, the port, he did not reside actually in Medina and Mecca, and the traditional Arabic dynasty, that is the Hashemite dynasty, which styled itself as Emir and Sharif of the holy cities, continued to administer the pilgrimage trade and defend the cities, but now representing their authority as coming from the new caliph resident in Constantinople. And that resulted in a number of explanations of what the Ottoman Caliphate meant to those well-versed in Quranic law and Quranic traditions, and this caused them to look back at that historian Ibn Khaldun. I mentioned Ibn Khaldun earlier as having a very, very important influence on the Ottoman conception of their own empire. Ibn Khaldun is clearly the foremost historian of early Islam. He worked out a whole paradigm on how dynasties evolve and how they fall. Modern historians and political scientists are very keen on his understandings on the weaknesses of a dynasty, but even more significant to the Arab subjects of the Turkish Caliph was what happened to the Caliphate after the death of Ali in 661. Ibn Khaldun concluded that, in a sense, the Caliphate ended, that the men who followed after Ali, who were not members of that first four, the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, at best, they had the glory of the caliph without really being caliphs, that they had the powers of a caliph so long as they followed Sharia, so long as they protected the community of believers. And that notion, which was widespread in the religious schools in the 16th century, gave a way of reconciling the fact that you now had a Turkish caliph ruling over the Arabic-speaking populations of the core lands of Islam, including the very birthplace of the Prophet himself. And that was important because it led the Arab subjects of the Ottoman Sultan to actually hold him in some ways to account. The acceptance of the Ottoman Sultan as caliph was always provisional. He had the glory of the caliphate. He had the office of the caliphate without really being the caliph himself. And that position was provisional. So long as he maintained the borders of Islam and he ruled properly through Sharia, he was accepted as a de facto caliph. And that meant that the Sultan caliphs in Constantinople went through great efforts to co-opt and win the support of their Arab subjects because they knew this is the perception of what they were in the Arab lands. And the Arab lands now constituted 50% of the Ottoman Empire, close to half the population. It was also through those provinces which the various trade routes, the spice trade to the east especially, passed, and it was vital to control those lands. Cairo was the second largest city of the empire and home to all sorts of Islamic schools. And if it were not under Ottoman control, it was a rival for the religious and cultural authority of Sunni Islam. So as the defenders of Sunni Islam, it really was incumbent upon the sultans to come to terms with their Arabic subjects so they could win at least their approval, if not their active support. In this regard, much of the administration of the Arab provinces now makes sense. The sultans went through great efforts to court local elites. Now, to be sure, as these provinces came under control, first the former provinces of the Mamluk Sultanate, that would be Egypt, the Levant, and the northern areas of Iraq today, the Al Jazeera. And then between 1534 and 1538, Iraq came under Ottoman control. It was traded hands several times with the Safavids, but by 1639, it is firmly Ottoman, and it will remain Ottoman down to the First World War. In all of these areas, the Ottoman Sultan had to come to terms with the existing traditions and the ruling elites. Now, the upper levels of the administration of the Arab provinces were clearly Ottomans sent from Constantinople. And you can make dossiers and biographies on all of these figures. Most of them were Muslims from the Balkans. They had come through either the madrasis in Constantinople or they were members of the elite from the Kulu Kapu, that is the servants of the Ottoman in the Topkapi Palace. When they arrived in the Ottoman provinces, many of them probably spoke no Arabic. From what we can tell, many of them probably felt quite isolated in what must have looked like to them an alien land. On the other hand, the Ottomans made sure not to impose the whole system of Timars on the Arabic provinces. There were a couple of exceptions in the area around Mosul and Aleppo, which were all important to control. But on the whole, the military forces in the Arab provinces were overwhelmingly local forces. There were garrisons of janissaries initially stationed in the 16th century, but increasingly these janissary units drew on local recruitment. And that clearly was the case by the 17th century. In addition to that important proviso, The judges who were sent in as the representatives of the Sultan, the Qadi, they almost all spoke Arabic. They had to be trained in Quranic law. They administered Quranic law in the imperial courts, and customary law obtained in the cities, among the guilds, and in the peasants' villages. And so that eased the transition very much from Mamluk or Safavid rule to Ottoman rule in those provinces. Each of the provinces had a different history or different trajectory, as a modern social historian would say. Let's take Egypt first. Egypt was perhaps the most important province financially for the sultans. It was on par with the Balkans. Its revenues were enormously lucrative, particularly the rice, the sugar, the wheat, and the cotton produced in the Nile Valley that fed the city of Constantinople. The city of Cairo was essentially the rival caliphate city, and it would only reemerge as the intellectual and political rival to Constantinople in the 19th century when it gained its independence again under Muhammad Ali. It was impossible to administer Egypt as if it were a province in the Balkans. And from the start, the Ottoman presence was restricted to Cairo. It very much depended on the permission of the leading families, who went back to the old Mamluk families, who maintained their own personal households. And these households were slaves purchased on the slave market. Many of them were Georgians, Circassians. They came through the slave trade at Kaffa. And in effect, this elite in Cairo, which essentially ran the province of Egypt for the port, is very often known as Neo-Mamelukes. It is a reinvented local elite. They came to terms with the janissaries and the governors sent from Constantinople, and the two groups actually fused into a new ruling elite in Cairo by 1600. Whoever controlled the mayor of Cairo, which had to be elected from the leading families, the leading Neo-Mameluke families, essentially controlled Egypt. And any governor coming into Egypt had to be acceptable to those leading families of the Neo-Mamelukes, as well as the military forces stationed there. And so a kind of power broker situation was worked out between the port in Constantinople and the government in Cairo. And this had become clearly the only solution, because soon after Egypt had been secured, Suleiman the Magnificent faced two major revolts in Egypt. He had to send his Grand Vizier in there to reorganize the province, and it quickly became very, very clear that the Ottoman state would be overtaxed if it tried to rule Egypt directly the way they did provinces in the Balkans or in Asia Minor. Another example of how you co-opt local elites would be Baghdad. Baghdad, when it finally came under the control of the Ottomans, effectively from 1639 on, as a result of the successful war of Murat IV, Baghdad in many ways was a provincial town living on the memories that it once had been a capital of the Caliph. But there again, leading families were co-opted. And in this case, starting in the 17th and early 18th century, there were powerful families who were ions, notables, engaged in the tax farming, and they were able to maintain powerful households of Mamluks, mostly Circassians, and Georgians obtained from the Caucasus area. And in effect, they ruled as local figures representing the authority of the Sultan, and they were essentially semi-independent rulers. Nonetheless, they would regard themselves as Ottomans, and they were loyal to the Sultan because their authority in Baghdad rested on the titles, the turbans, the seals of office, and all of the approval of the Ottoman state. And again, it was a very, very sensible way of sharing power between a powerful elite who spoke Arabic, who had the connections to get things done, and at the same time realized that their position rested very much on the backing of the Sultan Caliph in Constantinople. And you see these arrangements made across the Fertile Crescent in the cities of what we today call Syria. In the far west, the Maghreb, in Tunisia and Algeria, the authority was even looser. their beys protested a loyalty to the Sultan in Constantinople and ruled pretty much independently and really carried out their own pirate raids, the so-called Barbary pirates in popular literature, against the Christian foe in the Western Mediterranean. And they really didn't care what happened at Lepanto. They were engaged in their own war against the Christians, as well as piracy, which, after all, they saw as acting as privateers under the authority of the Sultan, to see it from their viewpoint. And so all across the Arab world, there were these compromises. There was a very significant compromise when it came to the holy cities. In 1517, the traditional ruling family was in power. The Hashemites had control of the pilgrimage routes. And the Bedouin tribes along the rim of the Fertile Crescent that guarded those pilgrimage routes were all co-opted as well. As I mentioned before, any governor in Aleppo who did not pay attention to the Hashemites in the Holy City, or tribes like the Mawali who patrolled the eastern frontier of Syria, woe to him if there was any interruption of the Hajj, because that's one thing the Sultan would not tolerate. There was a great deal of independence and latitude given to the tribal communities, the Bedouins. On the other hand, what the Sultan wanted to make sure is his taxes came in, order was kept in the main cities, and the Hajj went forward, because that was crucial to his legitimacy as the Sultan Caliph. And that system was more or less in place down to 1915, with one exception we'll get to in a moment. In 1915, when Prince Hussein finally kicked in with the British in the so-called Arab Revolt, he was very, very leery of shaking off that Ottoman tutelage, because it had been so profitable for his family so long, and he was really forced to make a decision, and rather reluctantly went in rebellion against the Ottoman Empire and against the traditions of his family, which was a very, very lucrative arrangement. To give you some sense of how powerful those locals were at the court of Constantinople, when the railway system was being built in the 19th century, the railway system was extended from Aleppo eventually to Medina, but it was never extended to Mecca, because the tribes protested, including the Hashemites, that would cut into their revenues on the Hajj trade, and that was unacceptable. And if you didn't want to have a rebellion of the Arab tribes, you better not build the railway, and the threat worked. The Sultan backed off on the idea. Abdul Hamid II would not alienate those tribes. It was too important that the Hajj continue. So I mentioned that there were some exceptions to the at least passive acceptance of the Ottoman Sultan. One was Egypt. I mentioned earlier that from the start, to his credit, Suleiman and his immediate successors understood that Egypt was an exceptional province. It's just too large. It has a long tradition of independent sultanates going back into the 9th century. And there was always a danger that a powerful governor might break away and create a government in Egypt. And that became very clear at the end of the 18th century. A member of one of the leading families, one of the Neo-Mamluk families, got himself elected as mayor in 1768. He is known as Ali Bey El-Kabir. From his position as mayor, he could dictate who the governor of Egypt should be. Very much the Mamelukes and the so-called Janissaries, who at this point are all essentially local military forces, lined up with him. He conducted virtually his own foreign policy vis-a-vis the French and evaded the Sultan's writ when it came to export-import quotas of grain to Marseille. He profited immensely on the growing trade with the French under the old capitulations of 1740, and he hired a large army that some would number as much as 25,000 men, and these included large numbers of slave soldiers bought on the slave market. And invariably, there was going to be a head-on collision with the Sultan in Constantinople, and it broke out in 1771 when he literally ordered his personal army, Ali Bey, to march on the city of Damascus. and overthrow Ottoman rule in the Levant and seize the Levantine ports, which were essential for defending Egypt. Clearly, he was thinking of breaking away. The army got to Damascus, and then the governor rebelled and defected over to the Sultan. He sent in another army in 1772. That was defeated. And a year later, finally, with naval and military forces, the Ottomans reoccupied Egypt and imposed the authority of the Sultan on the Nile Valley. It was a very, very strong warning of the danger of what could happen in Egypt. And the Ottoman control in Egypt by the end of the 18th century had become quite tentative. And when Napoleon shows up in 1798, not too long from now, you can understand why the Sultan Selim III was so distressed. He saw an outsider once again reviving the potential rival in Cairo. The other place, which was unexpected, was in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, I mentioned that the Sultan really had very, very little interest of what was going on in the Arabian Peninsula, so long as the caravans of pilgrims made it to Mecca and Medina. And that meant the only areas effectively controlled were the Hajj, that is the area around Medina and Mecca, which was in the hands of the Hashemites. Well, in the early 18th century, a inspired mentor, a prophetic figure emerged. His name is Abd al-Wahhab. His followers are now known as the Wahhabists. Abd al-Wahhab preached against the Ottoman pietism. He did not see any reason why memorial tombs should be venerated, as was common in Sunni Islam in the Ottoman period. He railed against all the relics that had been collected in the Topkapi Palace, from the sword of the prophet to the beard of the prophet. All of this was nothing more than heathenism. Anything that was not consistent with the religion of Islam at the time of the prophet was obviously an abomination. And that included a Turkish caliph. It also included almost everything that would be associated with the Shiite tradition, which was upheld by the rulers of Iran. And the Wahhabists made common cause with the powerful tribes in the central Arabian desert, the House of Saud, who later would give their name to Saudi Arabia. Muhammad ibn Saud linked his fortunes, linked his Bedouin warriors to this new Sunni fundamentalism. And his son and successor carried that in a war against the pilgrimage shrines that were under the protection of the Ottoman Sultan. In 1802, Wahhabists mounted on camels sacked the city of Karbala, a great Shiite site. There was a massacre. And while these were Shiites, many of them were Ottoman subjects, or they were pilgrims from Iran that were under the protection of the Sultan Caliph. In 1803, they occupied Mecca. They came back in 1805 and 1806. They disrupted the pilgrimage trades. 3 times, the Sultan Mahmud II or his predecessor, Ahmed III, had sent armies against the Wahhabists into the desert to no effect. In 1811, out of desperation, Sultan Mahmud II, the man who will destroy the Janissaries in 1826, turns to Muhammad Ali, the independent ruler in Egypt, and asks him to crush the Wahhabists. And it takes 2 expeditions for him as well. It is only the second one, in 1817, 1818, when his most talented son, Ibrahim, gains control of the bases of the Wahhabists and ends this Wahhabist state. But it had tested the Ottoman Sultanate to the extreme. The loss of those holy cities, the emergence of a fundamentalist group like that, that raised doubts within all the Arab provinces. If the Turkish Caliph can't protect us, is he still Caliph? And the experience of dealing with the Wahhabists would haunt the Sultan Caliph through the rest of Ottoman history. And they were painfully aware that their position rested provisionally on their ability to defend the Islamic world. It is always ironic to me that there were 2 events at the end of the empire that really tested this long loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan. One were all the modern reforms brought in that tried to bring a central state into the Arab provinces after 1909 especially. That alienated the local elites. That brought an intrusive Ottoman rule in provinces that had long been able to govern themselves with a nominal loyalty to Constantinople. And then, the most ignominious of all was defeat at the hands of the Italians in Libya in 1911, 1912. That is the first time an Arab land had actually been lost by an Ottoman army. To the weakest of all the European powers, a province that was not very important, but it undermined the authority of the Sultan Caliph and really was never forgotten by the reformers who had fought in that war. And they remembered that defeat and its consequences when the First World War broke out. But until those defeats in the 19th and early 20th century, for 300 years, the Sultan had pursued a very sensible policy that had won over his Arabic subjects, that had seen the flourishing of later Arabic literature, and had given prosperity and peace to provinces that had long been ravaged by war in the late Middle Ages. And again, that is a remarkable achievement for the Turkish Caliph Sultan in Constantinople.